My guest today is Colin Hitt, the Executive Director of the Policy Research in Missouri Education Prime Center at St. Louis University in Missouri. He is also a homeschooling dad and the co-author of a new study published last month in the Journal of School Choice on homeschooling in his state. That study reveals that over 60,000 students, or about 6% of the student population in Missouri, are homeschooled. And this, of course, reflects larger national trends that we're seeing on homeschooling, showing homeschooling continuing to be a popular option for many families. In fact, studies out of Johns Hopkins University find that in many states that report homeschooling data, homeschooling numbers were up in the fall of 2023 compared to the fall of 22, and overall homeschooling numbers dramatically increasing from pre-pandemic levels. So great to see a state-specific snapshot at the Prime Center. So Colin, welcome to the LiberatED podcast.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So, I'd love to start by hearing a little bit about your motivation for conducting this study. What were some of your hypotheses going into it, and what did you find?
We really started with a data puzzle. This is the first paper that the Prime Center has ever done on homeschooling. And really, we just started looking for basic numbers. What are homeschooling trends in Missouri pre and post pandemic to find that the State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education has no official count, makes no real attempt really to figure out how many kids are homeschooling. And the same actually goes for private schooling in Missouri. Turns out Missouri is one of 20 or more states that either doesn't collect that data or doesn't publish it. They're in the same league as Illinois or New York, California, Texas. So we decided to try it. And we tried every single approach we could think of, and we arrived at an estimate that we're pretty confident in, that at least 61,000 of the 1 million school-age kids that are in Missouri are homeschooling right now.
Yeah, it's just amazing. Some of the specific data points that you reveal in the study say that this shows that 1 in 16 school-age children in Missouri are now homeschooling. And what I thought was really fascinating is that that's more than the number of students in the state's two largest public school districts combined. That would be Kansas City and St. Louis. So more homeschoolers in Missouri than in those two big districts combined. What are your thoughts on what do you think is driving some of this interest in homeschooling from Missouri families?
Well, what's really interesting is the change. So that 61,000 number, or 6.1% of Missouri kids homeschooling, is 2 or 3 times the level post-pandemic. So something has changed. People's reasons or ability to homeschool have changed. So what do we think has changed over the last 5 years? An obvious one is that there are a bunch of families that got a taste of homeschooling or virtual learning during the pandemic and decided to stick with it. That's one. A second would be is there were a bunch of other families that may have always wanted to try this, but it wasn't until the world of remote work or hybrid work that they were able to make homeschooling work logistically. I think there's a third group. I think as homeschooling becomes more common or more popular, there are more people that are willing to try it. We live in a world of first adopters and second adopters and third adopters, and it may have been for a long time. Maybe that 2% or 3% of families that were homeschooling in Missouri were your kind of first adopters. And as it grew post-pandemic, there were more people who were willing to try it because they saw more people doing it. That's the third. And, the fourth is, I think, things have changed for schools, brick and mortar schools post-pandemic. Public and private schools in virtually every corner of Missouri and virtually every community are talking about how things are different. You can see it in test scores, you can see it in student attendance rates, you can see it in teacher turnover. There might be some parents that are saying, look, for now, at least homeschooling is, a more predictable or stable environment for our kids. Those are all things that are very different than they were even 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think those motivations are spot on. I especially, love your point around sort of network effects, right? That as more
Yeah,
and more people are doing this, then neighbors and others in the community say, "Oh, okay, well, that doesn't seem so out there."
yeah.
My stereotypes about homeschooling are smashed. These are, everyday people choosing this as a viable education option, and maybe I should look into it too. I'm wondering, I've talked to education entrepreneurs, school founders founders who are launching microschools or
Hmm.
homeschooling resource centers, including in Missouri, and they've seen their numbers skyrocket in recent years as well. How much of the growth in homeschooling, especially post-pandemic, do you think is related to the growth of some of these microschools and similar homeschooling collaboratives that make homeschooling so much more accessible to more families, where families are able to have their children go to these programs that are, in some cases, full-time school, alternatives to school at a fraction of the cost of traditional private schools, where families retain that kind of control over the education process and have much more input and have that flexibility and freedom that homeschooling provides, while being able to sort of tap into these more formal, resource centers and micro schools. Have you seen any of that? Did the study get into that at all?
Well, this is going to be one of the most interesting questions in the next 10 or 15 years for education researchers like me, is not only have we seen homeschooling increase, but the definition of homeschooling itself has completely changed. And to what extent are kids who are doing homeschooling now in environments that looked like homeschooling 10, 15 years ago? Probably not very many. Right. So, again, virtual schooling, everybody's heard about that. The advances there in that technology and the number of providers in that space has been huge over the past few years. Pods and hybrid schools, even that line between what is a private school and what is a pod, what is a homeschool, it's blurring as well. And we're even seeing public schools being more open, especially for kids with special needs, to kind of part-time enrollment options. All of these things are changing in a hurry. It's really going to be a fascinating thing to track. But to answer your specific question, did our study look at that? Not yet. We were really interested, first and foremost, is just how many kids are in homeschool, how many kids are, to put it the other way, how many kids are not in private school, are not in public school, or someplace else. That was really the exercise of our most recent study.
Yeah, well, so I'm glad that sort of further research, it sounds like, for the Prime Center
Yeah.
is to sort of dig into, okay, what are the modalities now of
Mhm.
these, sort of homeschoolers? What are they really doing? How many of them are more of the traditional version that we would think of with a parent at home doing the teaching, and how much of it is nothing like that at all, where it looks
Right.
more like what we would imagine a typical school environment looking like. So, that gets to sort of this next question of, it can be difficult in many states, especially states like Missouri, where there is sort of no state level collection of data on
Yeah.
homeschoolers to determine how many homeschoolers are in a given area. How did you get around that as a researcher?
Right. Well, I would point out that even in states that do try to collect this data officially, we've got research from Stanford University and the Associated Press that says that that's basically inadequate and inaccurate post-pandemic. And we can go into the reasons why that's the case. But back to Missouri and states like it. So what did we do? We tried every approach we could think of. So we started with Census Bureau data, and then brought in State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education data. And then we brought in data from the Federal Private School Universe survey. We checked that against the CDC's live birth database, all to arrive at this one estimate of about 6.1% of families we think are homeschooling. But then we also went to polling data. We went to the U.S. Census Bureau's Household Pulse survey and also our own polling that we commissioned through YouGov at the Prime Center of Missouri parents, and our sort of poll of polls lined up with that same approach that I talked about earlier as well. So, and then we looked at a couple of other sources as well. But again, no matter what approach we tried, we kept arriving at a highly similar estimate, which makes us really confident in that sort of 6.1% or 61,000 kids in Missouri are homeschooling this most recent year.
Yeah, and again, it's tracking very similarly to data out of the Johns Hopkins Homeschool Hub, the recently launched data collection program there that's finding between 5 and 6% of students across the U.S. being homeschooled. So Missouri, right there. I would love you, if you don't mind, to dig
Mhm.
into what you mentioned earlier about the data could be slippery even in states where there might be reporting.
Well, I think at some point last year, a collaboration between Stanford University and the AP had a series of reports talking about the missing kids. And what they meant was when you add up the numbers of public school enrollments and private school enrollments and official homeschool counts, that does not account for all of the kids in a particular state, hence missing kids. The truth is those kids probably aren't missing at all. A vast majority of those kids are homeschooling, and you can understand why their parents might chafe at that term. But anyway, that's one way to frame it. Now, why is it that official registries might miss things? One is probably most parents don't know about it or don't know how to sign up for it, or it's cumbersome, or the process through, after which when parents do sign up, that data getting moved from one place to another is not ideal. For people who are outside of education, or outside of any field, right? You presume that there's data on everything. That's not really the case in K through 12 education. Most of our data sets are built to look at kids in public schools. And most of that is for the purposes of funding or for legal compliance. That's what the data systems are built to do. For kids outside of that, for kids in private schools, for kids in homeschools, for kids in preschool or even in college, our data systems just aren't nearly as comprehensive.
Yeah, that makes sense. I wonder if in your research or maybe future research projects you have planned, if you looked into the age sort of stratification of these homeschoolers. Are you finding, for example, that families are choosing homeschooling, however that might be delivered in
Mhm.
today's world, because of something that went wrong in a traditional setting or something wasn't
Yep.
working in a traditional setting, so they're opting out? Or are you seeing more families, as I am, and talking to sort of micro school founders, more families now kind of opting out of a conventional school, public or private, from the get-go and choosing something different, choosing alternative education before their child even hits school age, again, often using these micro schools or similar models? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of commentators who want this to be, a political thing or a reactive thing, parents doing this as some form of protest. And I just don't see evidence of that at all. I have a hard time believing that you'd see a doubling or tripling of homeschooling in a state like Missouri for reasons like that. And insofar as we've done polling of parents, some of which we've done at the Prime Center, that's not what we see. We see parents that are interested in having more control over their curriculum or want to push, look for more advanced material. We see a lot of parents with special needs kids that think that this is a more flexible and inclusive environment, for their children. Of course, there are parents that think this is a safer place as well. Fascinating work coming out of North Carolina State University, kind of first ever study of the experience of Hispanic homeschooling families, with that particular group of parents that they talk to, talking about this is an opportunity to keep kids close to their families, right? And it's so, there's 61,000 kids in Missouri that are homeschooling right now. You probably have 61,000 reasons for why parents will tell you that they do it. But I think most of these are very proactive and very optimistic reasons why they're doing it. But again, topic for future research.
Yeah, so where does this go from here for you, and some of your research? You mentioned, for example, that public schools are starting to respond to this increasing demand for homeschooling. You mentioned maybe being open to part-time schooling in some public schools.
Mhm.
I want to sort of have maybe this be a twofold question. The first part, and maybe you can respond to this first, is how do you expect public schools to respond to this
Mhm.
growth in homeschooling in all of its various forms?
Yeah, so I don't know. A lot of researchers will not say, I don't know, when they really should. But this is really going to be something that's interesting to watch. We kind of call this a quiet but seismic shift. You can sense something's going on underneath your feet, but the windows aren't rattling and nobody's taking cover, but something is different. That's why we did this sort of study. If this growth continues, and right now we're seeing no evidence of homeschooling numbers bouncing back to pre-pandemic numbers, but if this growth kind of slowly but steadily continues, I think you're going to see a lot of public schools changing what they do in response to this. I'll also add, and you mentioned John Hopkins University Homeschool Hub earlier, fantastic resource and fantastic group of researchers they put together there. Albert Chang and others at the University of Arkansas also doing really interesting work. One of the things that we're really seeing is of homeschoolers, it's really a minority who are homeschooling for the entire K through 12 journey. There's a lot of homeschooled children that are kind of bouncing back and forth between homeschooling and brick and mortar schools, if not grade to grade, at least maybe during these chunks, like yes, homeschool for middle school, but something else for high school. That's a fascinating thing to watch as well. But public schools, all brick and mortar schools, are going to kind of have to adapt to that too, that more of the kids that are coming to them will be coming from a homeschooling environment.
Yeah, and then so then the other part of that question then is where do you see kind of homeschooling go? You
Mhm.
said that you don't see us going back to pre-pandemic levels. You think this is going to continue to be a popular choice for families. Care to make any predictions on growth? Will it plateau? Where do you see that going? Both in Missouri for homeschoolers and nationally.
Well, I'll talk to you about a place that I was wrong. So, I would have guessed that we would have seen a spike during the pandemic and some type of reversion to pre-pandemic trends, if not all the way. Maybe there was a permanent boost, but nothing like what we saw in like 2021. And that's not what we see at all. We see this jump in Missouri, at least, from 2 or maybe 3% of children homeschooling up to 6% or higher. And it has stayed there in all of our early indicators, and including enrollment data out just in the fall of 2024 suggests that this is pretty stable.
So, what is next for you in terms of future research projects at
Oh, well,
Prime?
yeah,
Yeah.
sure. For the Prime Center, we'll put out probably 25 studies, reports, or policy briefs this year. And they cover, a gamut of topics as wide as K through 12 itself, everything from education finance to special education, PE, charter schooling in Missouri, standardized test trends, and of course, homeschooling. And we've got to be talking about all of those things and many, many more if we're going to be talking about those 1 million kids that are school age kids in our state.
And then, in terms of education policy, in
Mhm.
particular school choice policy, I know your study was recently published in the Journal of School Choice.
Yep.
Missouri has a small tax credit scholarship program, a small education savings account program. And, I'm wondering where you see homeschooling and school choice and sort of expanding options for families intersecting.
Yeah, and that'll be an interesting development as well. So, Missouri, like a number of states, has a program that ultimately ends up with education savings accounts for parents where they can flexibly use funding if they participate for things not just like private school tuition, but other education support materials, tutoring, the types of things that homeschooling parents could really use. Reasonable people can debate whether or not that's good or bad policy, but even within the homeschooling community, you do see some division. There are some that say no, don't include homeschooling families in these. We want to be completely left alone. And there are others that say, wait a second, no, we need and could really use these supports for our kids. We want them. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
So, Colin, if my listeners and viewers want to learn
Mhm.
more about the Prime
Yeah.
Center, follow your research, look forward to new studies being published in the near future, what is the best way for them to do that?
Well, primecenter.org. Our name is our website. That's primecenter.org, or you can find us on LinkedIn, X, Instagram, Facebook, all of the social sites to keep track of what we're doing. Or tune into your podcast, which I guess they already have.
Well, it's so great to talk with you. I'm so grateful that scholars like you are doing research on homeschooling and especially revealing homeschooling trends. So it's extremely helpful in my work, and I think it really provides the necessary data, the necessary information to see kind of what all of this means and where we might be going. So really appreciate all of your hard work, and I look forward to following the Prime Center as well. So Colin Hitt, thank you so much for being on the Liberated podcast.
Thank you, Kerry.